All right, if you were not here last week, first of all, shame on you, but we're glad that you came this morning. Secondly, if you did not get to hear last week's message, I would really strongly encourage you to go back out and watch that message. There were so many things we talked about who we are as the CrossWalk. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that today. But this morning, I want to kind of lay out for you the underpinnings, what am I trying to say? The foundation for what I preach and for what we teach around here and what we believe. And I hope that this will just make so much sense to you and you'll walk away going, okay, now I understand why David says some of the things that he says. Luke chapter 15, verses 1 and 2. This is where we started last week, and I want to get in there again. So look at this with me. He said, says, now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. And we know why that's important. We're going to talk about that in just a minute again. Verse 2, but the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. We live in a performance-driven world. We live in a world where our value is exhaustingly tied to our performance. You know, you're only as valuable as what you put out and give and do and so forth. We are constantly being told what to do and who to become and how to change so that our lives can be better. There's always somebody telling us what we could do different. And I am absolutely convinced and have been for quite some time that we desperately need relief from that kind of pressure. So, this is what I think about when Sunday mornings come along and Sunday morning becomes one more setting, one more place for a performance evaluation. Can you blame a person who just wants to stay home? I don't, if that's what they think church is. And I think that is what church is for some people. You know, we are given performance treadmill instructions out in the world all week. You got to do this, you got to keep it going, you got to keep life moving. And then we come to church on Sunday morning, and in some places we get another performance treadmill set of instructions. And it's no wonder to me that people choose to stay home. They're like, why would I go? I'm exhausted. And I think what the church needs to hear today are the words of Jesus from the cross. It is finished. Instead of, just do it. Just do it. I don't think that's what God intended for us to be in the business of sharing. So I think it's important, and we talked about this last week, it's important to remind you and to remind myself of who we are as a church. What the CrossWalk is, what we believe, why we believe it. Our mission statement says that we are to lead the broken to the cross, and we're going to walk with them in the love of Jesus Christ. So we are supposed to be a place where God's boundless love meets a broken world. That's what we are about. And so we've shortened that from day one, and we've just called ourselves a church for broken people. Now, the title of this series, which is a real super long series, isn't it? We had the first one last week. We got the last one this week. Okay? So that's what it's going to be. The title of this series is Square Pegs in a World of Round Holes. And the reason that I chose that is because that's what I feel. And that's what I see in the world around us. As the CrossWalk, we are square pegs in a world of round holes. On the one hand, we don't fit in. On the other hand, we have a story to tell to anyone who will listen. I know this is going to be shocking to you, but last summer I turned 65. I know. You're going, oh, David, you're not a day over 35, you know. Okay, maybe 45. Some of you need to stop right there with the smirks. I see that. But for a majority of those 65 years, I have felt like a square peg in a round hole. I'm not complaining about that because I happen to believe that it's actually true. But still, while it has made my life harder at some times, I feel like being a misfit or a square peg with the round hole, I feel like being a misfit has come natural to me. I'm not trying to be a misfit. I just I'm just that way in a lot of different ways. When I was let go or fired from the church that I was a part of 4 years ago, Alita and I did not know what we were going to do next. We honestly didn't. We had no idea what was ahead. All we knew was that in those moments, God's grace was meeting us in some very, very dark places. Now, we have not hidden our journey from you from day one. We've not hidden our feelings about that journey. But we decided early on that we could not hold a grudge towards the people that had, in a nice way, shown us the door. Okay? We're not doing that primarily because their disgust with me has helped me turn to God again and again and again. And in the process, we have found true freedom and fulfillment from a well that never runs dry. And to that end, the CrossWalk has become a refuge for people like us. And even though our circumstances, mine, yours, the person sitting next to you, even though our circumstances may be very different, we understand what it means, don't we, to lose. We understand regret. We understand failure. And we understand all of these things. So, as I said last week, when we collectively made the decision to start the CrossWalk, we didn't do so to create a church for Christians. We didn't start this place to be a church for non-Christians. We wanted to be a refuge for people who are broken, for people who are busted, for people who are down on their luck. So when I use the word misfit or square peg, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the people that Jesus identified in the verse that we looked at last week. Let's put it back up there, Luke 15, verse 1. This is so telling. It says, now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. These are the people who are unrighteous, and they know it. These are the people who are needy, and they know it. These are the people who require mercy, and they know it. And I believe that's who we are as well. There's a very interesting movie called Bohemian Rhapsody, which I think some of you have probably seen. It's a story of the band Queen as a group, and then Freddie Mercury in particular as the leader of that band. But there's a scene in this movie where a music executive is meeting with the band for the very first time. And at that point, Queen was unknown, unsigned. They had not made a splash anywhere yet. Now, this executive wanted to meet with them to see if maybe they would be a group that his label would be interested in supporting. At one point in the conversation, the music executive looks straight at Freddie Mercury, and he says this. He says, so tell me, what makes Queen any different from all the other bands I meet? And Freddie said this, and this is a direct quote from the movie. He says, I'll tell you what it is, Mr. Reed. We are four misfits who don't belong together, and we're playing for the other misfits. They are the outcasts at the back of the room, and we're pretty sure they don't belong either. We belong to them. I think some of us can identify with that statement. We know what it is to be an outcast who is with all the other outcasts in the back of the room. I don't belong. You don't belong. But the great thing is we belong to each other. We are outcasts. But we have been cast together by the God who seeks to take care of the lost and the guilty and the fearful. I borrowed this next line. I just thought it was so good. We are card-carrying members of God's lunatic fringe. I like that, don't you? I'll be a part of the lunatic fringe if you'll come with me. And more importantly, we belong to a misfit God. Now, you got to be careful when you say that one, because there's going to be somebody that's going to go, how dare you refer to God, the God of the universe, as a misfit? Well, I would say, first of all, don't miss the context in which I made that statement. My point in calling God a misfit is that God doesn't fit in with all the other gods of religion and culture. God isn't like other gods who demand cleanliness and achievement and goodness in order to be saved. He doesn't fit in with all the other gods that we see in our world today. The gospel of those gods is no gospel at all. It's what I would call the anti-gospel. What does the word gospel mean? Good news, okay? So the anti-gospel, this is not good news, okay? And I believe that's what the gods of this world are bringing to us. Their gospel is about all that we can do, all that we can become, all that we can make ourselves into, instead of focusing on what God has already done. The gospel says, if you want love, you don't have to make yourself lovable. God already thinks you are. If you want acceptance, you don't have to make yourself acceptable. If you want significance in your life, you do not have to make yourself someone important. Now, turn all those around, and that's what we hear in our culture today. We hear it in the church. We hear it outside the church. We hear it every time we turn on the television. We are bombarded by the anti-gospel of the lesser gods. So in that sense, the God we're talking about, I would say, if you're going to write that down, would be big G God, okay? And he doesn't fit in with all the small g gods. I taught a few years of psychology at junior colleges when I lived over in Illinois. And inevitably, there was at least one student in every class who tried really, really hard to impress me. And I'm sure there was probably one of these in every class that I taught. But I remember this guy because he was so insistent. It was so important to him that I know how important he was because that made him feel more important. Kind of feels like a circle after a while, doesn't it? But it was so crucial to him. He had to get it across to me. So he would bring me different things. He would stay after class to talk to me about different things. And I've run across a lot of people like that, and I've run from people like that. You know what I'm talking about. But he's like so many of us in our world who've heard the gospel of the anti-gods and believed it. You know what they say? They say, you know what? In order for me to feel valuable, in order for me to feel important, in order for me to feel significant, I need other people to think I'm important. I need other people to think that I am someone. I need them to look at me and immediately think I'm a success. And with this guy, it was like he was always jockeying for position in order to be somebody. And I think in the story that we looked at with Jesus and all the people that were gathering around him, these are the people who knew they didn't have it. These are the people who knew that they needed something because they weren't going to make it on their own. It's called the gospel, the anti-gospel of lesser gods. But God isn't like those other gods. He doesn't fit with them, which makes him a misfit. I believe our God is a square peg in a world of round holes. In parable after parable in the New Testament, Jesus reveals a God who chooses to love all the wrong people. Have you ever just thought about this as we go through some of these stories? Jesus chooses to love the defiant son, not the compliant one. He chooses the ones who broke the Sabbath over those who kept it. He chooses to love the late, hungover day workers, not the ones who show up late to get the job, not the ones who, not the diligent all-day workers. If you read through the stories of Jesus, here's what you'll find. You'll see the bad people getting rewarded. You'll see the good people getting rebuked. And everybody's idea of who the winners and losers are gets turned upside down. He is a misfit God. He doesn't do what everybody else thinks he's supposed to do. See, Jesus was always making the religious leaders mad because he befriended and loved and touched the outcast and the leper and the liar and the cheater. He welcomed those people, as we read earlier, and he called them friends. But what made the religious leaders so furious was Jesus' constant habit of loving sinners. The religious people of the day didn't know what to do with that. He didn't do what they thought he should do. He didn't go where they thought he should go. He didn't say what they thought he should say. In the words, and I've used this quote before, of Mike Yaconelli, Mike said, according to his critics, Jesus did God all wrong. You know, he's supposed to be God, but they didn't think he was doing a very good job of doing that. So they thought he was supposed to do God differently, but he wasn't like the other gods. Grace always provokes those who think that they're good. Grace always ruffles the feathers of those who believe they're better. Grace is the enemy of those who need to think that they're better than they are. Grace is offensive to that kind of person. Grace is offensive to us, all of us, to the degree that we fall into that trap. I said last week that Jesus embracing, we were in John chapter 8 last week. You remember that story of the woman who was caught in the act of adultery? I said last week that Jesus embracing the falsely accused, the victim, the one who was not guilty, that's expected, right? That's not scandalous. And we looked at John chapter 8 where the woman who was caught in the act of adultery, the religious leaders drag her out and they throw her at the feet of Jesus. They're trying to test Jesus. And one of the things that I wanted to point out to you about that story is that the woman was, in fact, what? Guilty. Just totally guilty. She was a willful participant in what was going on. We won't mention the fact that it takes two to do that, so there would have been somebody else. But if Jesus welcomed her and accepted her or was kind to her because she was being falsely accused and she wasn't guilty, we would expect that. We would expect Jesus to stand up for her. But the fact that he welcomed her, loved her, and forgave her because she was guilty, that makes him a misfit God in the eyes of the Pharisees, who were the ones who drug her out in front of Jesus in the first place. They were trying to say that Jesus clearly was not God, because God would never welcome, love, and forgive the guilty. God would never do that. But that's exactly what Jesus did. What is scandalous is that Jesus loved the criminal who was caught in the act. Jesus loved the guilty who still had blood on his hands. Jesus loved the ones who stink of guilt. Filthy rich Zacchaeus. This woman that we've just talked about who was caught in adultery. Even, you ever thought about this? Even the Roman soldiers who were casually tossing dice in the shadow of his dying body. And what does Jesus say? Father, forgive them, because they don't know what they're doing. Who says stuff like that? The good news of God's love and forgiveness is not just for those who are bullied and brokenhearted, but the good news of God's forgiveness is even for the instigators. It's for the people who perpetrated these things. It's not just for the innocent, it's for the guilty, especially for the guilty. And I got good news for us. It's also for repeat offenders. Isn't that good? Okay, I thought that was really good because I'm a repeat offender. I don't know about you. What offends us most about Jesus is not who he leaves out. It's who he brings in. That's offensive, especially to the religious people. The people who tend to believe that they are better, which, by the way, is all of us. Okay, if we're really honest about this. Now, let me just say this. The last thing I want to happen at the CrossWalk is for us to become proud of the fact that we're not good. Do you see the irony in that? Yeah. Unfortunately, what sometimes happens is that some people become Pharisees to the Pharisees. You're going to think about that one. You take that one with you for the rest of the week. What I mean is this, it would be like them saying, well, you think you're good, I know I'm bad, and that makes me better than you. Is there something a little twisted about that? I think so. We want to avoid that at all costs, okay? So when I talk about rule keepers and anti-gospel people, Pharisees, I'm talking about all of us. We do not get off scot-free. That's all of us in the course of a regular day. None of us are completely rid of that stuff, and we won't be until the day we die or when Jesus comes back, whichever comes first. But the good news of God's love and forgiveness is not just for those hypothetical people or the ones we read about in the Bible, but the good news of God's love is actually for flesh and blood repeat offenders like you and me. The fact that Jesus' heart gravitates and moves toward and embraces the immoral and the criminal and the blamable and the scoundrels of society, that's really what makes our God such a misfit God. He doesn't fit in with other gods. We are a company of misfits, and we have been assembled by a misfit God who promises to never leave us or forsake us. Don't be confused by what I'm about to say. You see, grace is not cheap, and grace is not expensive. Grace is free. Some people, when I'm talking about this, I've been accused in the past of peddling cheap grace. I hate that phrase, cheap grace. People generally think I'm trying to sell God short in what he's trying to give to us, but that's not at all what I'm saying. Grace is a no-strings-attached gift of one-way love. It's his love to us. It's got nothing to do with our love for him. Grace is everything about what he gives to us. But to practice the way Jesus loved, to love the unlovable, to forgive the unforgivable, to stand with the guilty, to help save sinners, that may cost you favor with people, and that may cost you some friends. I have lost friends because I stood up with guilty people. I know people who have lost friends because they stood up with me. So while grace is free, it's a gift of God's one-way love to us, practicing that grace may cost us everything. Robert Capon, who's a fantastic writer, said this. We're going to put it up on the screen. He said, grace is wildly irreligious stuff. It's more than enough to get God kicked out of the God union that the theologians have formed to keep him on his toes, his divine toes, so that he won't let the riff-raff off scot-free. Sensible people, this is my favorite part of this. Sensible people, of course, should need only about 30 seconds of careful thought to realize that getting off scot-free is the only way any of us are going to get off at all. It's not going to happen unless God does it. I think that's such a good quote. He's describing a misfit God, a God who doesn't fit in with the other gods of this world, but also a God who oftentimes doesn't fit in to our preconceived notions of who God is. I wish it wasn't so, but there are a lot of people that really don't want to see God being too gracious. You know, I want people to pay for what they've done. Any approach to life, and this is where we're going to get deep. Can we get deep for like 3 minutes? Don't time me. Please don't time me. Any approach to life that focuses on us and what we need to do to make something of ourselves is what Martin Luther called a theology of glory. I don't know if you've ever heard of that before, but Martin Luther called it a theology of glory. Not God's glory, but our glory. A theology of glory is not about God at all. It's about me. It's not about what God does. No, it's about what I do. It's about my performance, my potential, my strength, my improvement, my achievement. Its main message, and this is one of the things that we stress at the CrossWalk, the main message of this theology of glory is that I need to do more, I need to try harder, I need to climb higher, and we can just keep going on with those pictures in order to be the kind of person that God wants me to be. That's what our world is telling us. You've got to do more. You've got to be more. You've got to try harder. That is not what God says. That's the anti-gospel of a theology of glory. See, a theology of glory makes our lives all about working and earning and deserving and getting paid for it. In other words, I want to be able to earn my way into heaven. I want to earn God's favor on my life. If I go to church often enough, if I put a something in the offering every week, if I do this for somebody else, then God will be impressed. And God's going to look at me and say, wow, aren't you something? That's not the way that it works at all. The problem with this theology of glory is it has no room for failure. It has no room for weakness. It really has no room for being human because it's about me. It's about my work and my performance. It's terribly self-centered, and it is quite often enslaving. It's ultimately an attempt on our part to make ourselves into God. If we're good enough, then we can call our own shots, right? And can I just tell you about this working our way into being God? We are just not big enough to fulfill that job description, okay? Just turn to the person next to you just to make sure they're still awake and just tell them, you are not God, okay? And I hope that was not like a rude awakening. Okay, so that's one side of it, is this theology of glory. The opposite of that is what Luther called the theology of the cross. Theology of the cross. And the theology of the cross is life. The theology of the cross tells us that everything we need Don't put that on Marvin. Are we good? Okay. Yeah. Thank you, sir. Everybody tell Marvin thank you. They were just getting comfortable. Go back to theology of the cross. Yes, ma'am. If they only knew what our lives were really like, huh? I think you understand the idea that everything that we need, we don't come up with it. It's already been given to us, and it's free. We are not defined by our, at best, half-hearted attempts to please God. We are defined by God's wholehearted movement toward us. A theology of the cross says we are not defined by our worst moments or our greatest accomplishments, our struggles or our successes. We are defined, please, if you get this idea, then we will be a success today. We are defined by who we belong to. We are defined by who we belong to. That's our identity. Our identity is anchored in who we belong to. That's who we are at our core. It's not what we do. It's never been about us. It's about what's been done for us. And this is what's so hard for people that are coming out of some of the other ways of doing things, because we're all kind of led to believe that it's about what I do. And I got to do this, and I got to do that, and I got to do more. No, you don't. You just have to receive what God has done for you. And it's who we belong to. It's who our family is. It's who the head of our family is. It's knowing that our life is not dependent on our strength and resolve, but it's dependent on the strength of God to get us through. So all the voices that we hear in the world and all of the chatter that we hear in our heads that are constantly pushing us to do more and become something so that we can achieve the kind of status that we want, or that we can become somebody important, if we do that, it's all anti-gospel. it's all bad news. The anti-gospel says it's all riding on you. The gospel says it's all riding on Jesus. So what keeps us connected to God is not something that we do. What keeps us connected to God is how tightly he holds on to us, even when we let go of him, especially when we let go of him. Please understand, we are safe and sound in his boundless love because of his faithfulness, not ours. It's because of his work, not ours. It's because of his performance and obedience, not ours. That is the good news, because a religion of human goodness, a religion of human potential and strength, is exposed for the unhelpfulness that it is when you go through a period in your life where everything falls apart. It all falls out, the bottom gets pulled out from under you, and all that help that you thought you were getting strong enough to handle on your own, See, that's called a performance mentality. It's a religion of doing and working and accomplishing. All of that falls flat when life falls apart. Now, let's be honest, it's never easy to admit our faults and our failures, is it? It's never fun to do. It's never fun for me to admit my shortcomings to myself, let alone admitting them to you. I've had situations where people take what I say and they use it against me. I can't control that. But I haven't come up with a better way for you to see the glorious work of God than to show you where I blew it and how God turned around and used that for his good. I don't know how to tell you about God's goodness without sharing with you some of my badness. I want you to see through my life and through the life of this church that God is in fact a friend of sinners. Isn't that good news? Jesus loved so much more than just the good people who had their lives together. In fact, we wonder if those people really do exist. The good people who have their lives all together. If we don't admit that we don't have our lives together, then how are people ever going to really see that Jesus loves people who don't have it all together? So what do? Well, I know what we do. We sweep it under the rug. If we have something that happens in our lives, we just want to sweep it under the rug, and we don't want anybody else to know about that. It's kind of hard, by the way, when a church lets you go, because everybody in the community knows that something happened in that church. But if we don't, if we lie to ourselves about ourselves, all because we're afraid if people really knew us, they would not love us. So what we do is we edit our lives. We cut and paste our life story because of the fear of being rejected. But that's the glory of a theology of the cross. It sets us free. Get this. Theology of the cross sets us free to talk about ourselves and admit our shortcomings and failings, because the only person's approval that we really need is God's, and we already have that. The only person whose love you actually need is God's love, and you already have that. You and I can now endure rejection from other people because we will never have to endure rejection from God. So I can tell you the truth about myself, and if you walk away from me when I do that, I'm going to be okay, because God will never walk away from me, ever. It's that unconditional love that grounds us and gives us the backbone to tell the truth about ourselves. Now, I'm going to make this statement twice this morning. Let me give it to you now. The first time, those who are the most free are those who have the least fear of telling the truth about themselves. Those who are the most free are those who have the least fear telling the truth about themselves. And those who have the least fear telling the truth about themselves are those who know how unconditionally loved they are by God. And when you know that you are gripped by a love that will never let you go, that you are loved by, you're gripped by a love that will not give up, and you know that, when you know that, it gives you strength and courage to be honest first with yourself, and secondly with the people around you. Now, please, I'm not talking about just letting it all hang out to everybody. You know, it's kind of like throwing up on people. You know, you just kind of whoosh, let it all out. I'm not talking about that. Nobody likes to be on. Amen? Yeah. Well, I'm just putting into practice what Pastor David said, so sit down and listen, because I'm going to tell you every dirty little dark secret I have. No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the fact that we are free to tell the truth about ourselves without fear. It doesn't mean that we tell everybody everything. It means that when we need to tell the truth about ourselves, we are free to do so because we will never lose God's love for us, even if we lose the love of the person that we're telling. So I'll say it again. Those who are most free are those who have the least fear about telling the truth about themselves. And those who have the least fear telling the truth about themselves are those who know how unconditionally loved they are by God. See, the good news of Christianity doesn't really ring true in our minds until we admit that we are weak and we need help. Before that, honestly, and this may be where some of you are this morning, it's just a religion. It's just a tool, maybe to better ourselves. Christianity doesn't really take hold until our hearts are desperate, which is to me why a place like the CrossWalk fits into our society. The good news of Christianity, the truth of Christianity really hits home when we can admit that we are the ones in need and we are not as together as people think we are. Just turn and tell the person next to you. You got to tell them that. Just tell them, I'm not as together as I look. Just tell them. See? All right, we're getting all the hypocrisy out of the room, okay? The good news of Christianity, the truth of Christianity, really hits home when we can admit that we are in need. That's when it becomes good news to us, that we are loved no matter what. No matter what. If the CrossWalk does nothing more than get that across to us so that we can share it with other people, then this church will have been a success. By the way, any other God would have given up on us a long time ago. But our God never stops. He never gives up on us. The psalmist tells us that God's love never ceases. God's love never fails. Unlike all the other gods, our God accepts us with no strings attached. Again and again and again. Please don't give in to the lesser gods. Don't give in to the fear and the shame. And by the way, we're not going to find God's acceptance anywhere else than right there. Last thing I want to give you is something that Eugene Peterson used to use when he would write handwritten letters. There were these three words: grace, always grace. I know a lot of you are going, Eugene Peterson, I don't know. If you've ever read from the Message Bible, that's Eugene Peterson. He did all of that for his church because he had people that were trying to read from the old versions of the Bible and it wasn't making sense to them. So he started a project. He started putting the Bible into words that his church people could understand. And that's where the Message came from. But whenever he would write a letter, this would be what he would put under his name. Grace, always grace. I like that. When I think of the people in my life who have had the biggest impact on me, their superpower is grace. Grace is the secret sauce that attracted me to them. And by the way, the more gracious we are to other people, the more they will be attracted to the God of grace. And how can we be anything but gracious when all we have ever been given is grace from God? That is the CrossWalk. That is what we have to share. If we really haven't gotten to grace yet in your life, if you haven't really gotten to it yet, please consider the love of Jesus. Because at one point in your life, that is going to be the turning point for you. And That is what sets our church apart. That we consider, that we trust, that we get into this unending, outrageous, unexpected love of the Father. And that's why the crosswalk has to be here. Would you bow with me in prayer, please? Father in heaven, I'm not sure I want to know exactly how you see each one of us today. Because there's a part of me that wonders how you look past my faults. How do you ever get over the things that I've done that have not brought glory to your name but shame? Father, I thank you for the fact that according to what I read and what I see, you never gave up on me. And if you haven't done it by now, you're not going to do it in the future either. Father, please let every one of us in this room find some sense of joy, some sense of happiness because of the acceptance we have. Father, you are incredible. And we thank you for your love. And we thank you for not quitting on us. In the name of Jesus, we pray this. Amen. Stand up, please.